So it's my pleasure to introduce Tomer Ullman, who is the Morris Kahn Associate Professor of Psychology at Harvard. Tomer got his PhD at MIT in Brain and Cognitive Science, which was the program that I did my PhD in. And so when I first met Tomer, he had the kind of like mythical status of the graduate, the senior graduate student, a senior graduate student in the department who was already there when he got there. He was a fixture in Josh Tenenbaum's lab, both as a student and a postdoc in 2018, when he joined the faculty at Harvard. His work is really at the intersection of AI and human cognition. He asks, I think, always like really interesting and creative questions in that space. Often his work is on topics for which people have a very intuitive understanding, but are that actually are kind of surprisingly tricky to formalize computationally. So an example of work in that space is distinguishing a possibility from a conceivability. I think like everyone right away can get the intuition that levitating a feather with one's mind is something which is conceivable, even though it's possible. Whereas levitating a feather with the number 5 is something which is just like not even conceivable. And he adds like some really nice work showing that people have actually very robust intuitions on these shades of possibility and conceivability, and that language model is. If you follow Tomer on social media, you might find yourself wishing you could take his undergrad classes, which always seem really fun. He teaches an interdisciplinary course that's structured like a Shakespeare play. It's not imagination, and it's got this format where it's structured like a Shakespeare play, where I guess it's got acts and scenes, and then each part of the course has a corresponding Shakespeare quote that comes from that act and that scene. And then recently he posted about he had an Act 6 for the course. There are no Shakespeare plays with Act 6. And so he had ChatGPT hallucinate an Act 6 quote from Hamlet. Yeah. Which actually turned into a kind of interesting reflection on hallucination and imagination and generation in AI models. Brings us to the theme for today, and why I think Tomer is a really great speaker for this alignment series and the AHOI talk series, which is that he's really a leader in thinking about social reasoning and humans and models. Both about thinking about theory of mind and AI systems, so how can AI systems think about other minds. And today is going to talk about loopholes. So these are cases where an agent can technically obey a rule or request even while subverting its intention. I think this is obviously really important as we think more and more about trying to get AI to be aligned and to follow not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. Great.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the invitation and the introduction. It's lovely to see you all. I should open with, so I gave a talk not that long ago in France, and I had to open in French. And the only thing I could say in French was that I don't speak French. That was the extent of it. And so talking to a linguist group and a computer science audience, I feel I need to do something similar, which is I'm not a linguist. I'm not a computer scientist, and I know that people have thought about some of the things I'm going to be talking about from that angle. I'm looking forward to kind of collaborations and thoughts and things like that. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. Okay, so here's an overview of how the talk is structured. I'm going to spend a few minutes, like 1 or 2, just what's my deal, what do I do? You've heard a bit from Kyle. I'm going to spend 30 more seconds on that. I then want to do some common grounding on theory of mind and intuitive psychology. I'm sure a lot of you have already thought about that or have it. Since you were at least 3, probably before. But I do want to common ground what I mean when I talk about theory of mind, because a bunch of this is not going to be about that, but going beyond simple views of theory of mind. And in particular, the first part of this is going to be about loopholes, and the second one is going to be about theory of mindlessness. Now, you notice it says talk 1 and talk 2, and the relationship between these is basically this for video, going to be talk 1. And then talk 2. These aren't really related to one another. There's going to be a sharp transition in the middle. They're related by the fact that they are kind of about more complicated things than simple theory of mind. But I'm not trying to build a grand theory which relates these two. It's just 2 different topics that I think would be interesting. Okay, people are on board with that. See some thumbs up. What's your view? So as you heard, I'm in the Department of Psychology at Harvard, where I have the Computational Cognitive Development Group, and I'm interested in what it says in the thing, right? Computation, cognition, and development. I'm particularly interested in common sense reasoning, right? The kind of reasoning that we all have, that we share cross-culturally from early on with other animals and things like that. Within that, I'm very interested in intuitive physics, right? How we understand the everyday dynamics of the world around us, right? You know that this is a clicker, that's visual recognition. You know what will happen if I kind of try and kick it and throw it around and things like that. So that kind of intuitive physics, and within that, the idea that we're kind of mentally simulating the world around us. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but a major focus of a lot of my work is on intuitive physics. So if you find that interesting, please let's talk after the talk. And I'm also interested in intuitive psychology, right? If you saw me walking down the street and kind of stopping and looking at this and smashing on the ground, you'd think about the physics of the situation, surely, but you'd also wonder what's wrong with me, right? What's going on? Did I just receive some bad news? Am I insane? What's going on in my mind, right? The kind of everyday mental attributions that we immediately do, even as non-psychologists, to people of interest. I'm interested in this work developmentally, so trying to like think about how children develop these notions, whether some are innate or some learn. And for all of these, I try to think about computational models that capture what it is that people are doing, and I'm comparing that to systems, whatever that means. And if you're interested more in that view, there's a little bit of that into a paper from 3 years ago. Okay. 30 seconds on what's my view. So moving on to theory of mind and intuitive psychology, again, this part is just common ground. This isn't my work per se. I work within this domain, and I just feel like in a group as large and as diverse as this, we should get some things on the table of what it is that we need. So by intuitive psychology, as I just mentioned, I'm referring to the very fast, automatic, early developing thing that we do, which is we look at the actions of other agents and entities. That we even seem to classify them, you know, this is not an agent, this is an agent. And the fact that this is an agent licenses these kind of mental attributions where we go from observable variables like my actions, my utterances, things like that, to unobservable variables like, you know, he's angry or she did it because she's paternalistic or things like that. These hidden mental variables, whether or not they exist, is a separate question. But the fact is we seem to be doing these attributions. This is a very, who knows this, by the way, just show of hands. Okay, who doesn't know this? Okay, great. So this is, does someone who know it want to say what this is? Hyder and Simmel, yes. So this is a 1944 experiment by Hyder and Simmel, where what they did was they brought people into the lab. I'm showing you a brief snippet of a video that they showed. It goes on for 1.5 minutes. You can find it on YouTube. I recommend it. It's worth 1.5 minutes of your time. And what they did was just show people this video and ask them, what do you see? And people say stuff like, oh, well, Big Triangle's a jerk, and just things are friends, and these kind of things. And you don't see the full context. It's actually pretty robust and consistent. Most people agree Big Triangle's an asshole. And that these two are friends or lovers, and he's trying to chase them, and now he's confused and angry and all this kind of stuff. What they don't seem to say, which is equally true of this stuff, is I see 3 entities. The large triangle is about 3 centimeters long. He's rotating counterclockwise at a rate of 20 radians, whatever, you know, that kind of thing. Which is true, but is not the kind of thing that people say about this, right? They very reliably and consistently and quickly and automatically attribute these mental states, even to stuff that they know are not agents, right? This is very early developing. So this kind of thing has been studied a lot in psychology and cognitive science and AI development, certainly in development. In development, some of you may be familiar with the Sally Ann task, where some aspects of intuitive psychology are tested by, for example, so I don't know if I should do this here. Suppose that like you have Sally is playing with this, for example, and then she puts it over here, and then she leaves the room. Okay, and then Anne watches all of this unfold. She checks that Sally left the room, goes over there and puts it over here, right? The person re-enters the room. The question is, where are they going to look for their clicker? And now you, as people who are older than 4 years old, you know that the clicker is actually over there, and you just say that. And you will be able to say that she will look for the clicker over there where she last left. Okay, so that's the Sally Ann task, and the idea is that you can attribute false belief to other people. Children around the age of 3 or 4 seem to then go through this transition where younger than 4, around 3, they will say both that they know where the clicker is, it's over there, and that the person from outside the room will look for the clicker over there. So they seem to be conflating like what they know about the world and attributing that to other people as if they don't have a notion of false belief. This is contestable and challenged, and there's many reasons to think that that's not quite right. I'm telling you this is an example of the kind of task that people have been using but also to give you a sense of how would you even, so supposing you take this on board, right? And again, want to make clear that this is not quite right, and it's been since the 1980s, and that this is not what we fully mean by intuitive psychology. Right? This is one example of a false belief test. Intuitive psychology is much broader than that. How might you capture something like that? There's multiple ways of trying to model this, right? You want an agent that looks at that scene and does those attributions that we certainly did as adults, forgetting the developmental trajectory, just decided. One way of doing this, not the only way, is to think of this as theory of mind, right? Theory of mind meaning that I attribute to other people these mental, unobservable states like beliefs. And in the most recent, I mean, like 2 decades ago, formalization of this, we can attribute probability states to other people as representing their beliefs, right? We say like, okay, her belief is that it's there. We can think of this basically as an inverse planning program. So those of you coming from computer science and the planning programs, right? The idea is that I think of other agents as having utilities, goal states, belief states, and things like that. I observe their actions, and then I do a backwards inference where I reason about those beliefs and utilities and things like that, right? Condition on the action, invert the planning program, place the probability distribution for yourself over other people's planning, probability distributions and utilities and things like that. And then you can do things like predict where will the agent go next, and make statements like, I think she thinks it's in the basket, or things like that. You can generalize to new situations, like I saw that this agent is willing to expend a lot of utility cost to get to that apple. It must want that apple, therefore it'll go to the so. And that kind of framework has been very useful in capturing people's quantitative and qualitative attributions of other people's mental states, including much younger than 3-year-olds and children even as young as pre-verbal infants seem to show intuitive psychology in the sense of like attributing mental states to other people in a way that is captured by this kind of English framework. Cool. Now, there's been an interest in this thing, a lot of interest in this in cognitive science. I said there's been a growing interest in this in computer science and AI. There's been an interest in this for a long time, but certainly it's been on the rise. Here I'm showing kind of the papers that include the phrase theory of mind in AI archive papers. And as you can see, it's kind of growing and growing. We should normalize that by the fact that for anything, if I said pumpkin, you'd probably see it's growing and growing. Alas, I didn't do that. Side note, by the way, I couldn't find, the only website that did this was like out of date. It only goes to 2023. So I it's 2025, 2026. Sorry, I have vibe coded with like Gemini to get this thing where like, get me all the papers from archive that mention this thing. It's like, great, here it is. And it produces a much nicer graph than this. It's like a very clear, like, it can't be that nice. Like, where are these numbers from? And it's like, you're right. I made up those numbers, but I'm pretty sure it looks.
If you go back to the 50s, Simon and Newell,
Yeah.
lots of theory of mind in their publication.
Yes, and so, but I'm not sure if those are on archive from, yes, absolutely. These numbers are, yes. But there's an issue with this. I think that it is conveying something true, which is that there has been a growing interest in the CS community and theory of mind over the last few years, not to say that there's never been an interest in it. There's certainly been a high interest in modeling this kind of stuff. AI and development and cognitive science have gone back to before the terms AI and cognitive science and cognitive development have been around. If you look at the foundational paper of Turing computing machines, it's out there. So, okay. And you'll get back and forth, like, do LLMs have theory of mind? Yes, they do. No, they don't. Something in the middle. So if you're interested in that, please go and read that paper. Will become summarize our views on whether they do with it. Okay. That's a lot of background. Let me now transition to that talk 1, talk 2. Is this okay so far? This was just scene some. Cool. Seeing some thumbs up. Okay. So within that, this idea, and also people have been thinking about AI, does it have theory of mind? Does it not have theory of mind? Theory of mind is kind of captured by inverse planning, but not just that. I've been worried or thinking about or wondering about this thing that is called loopholes, and that's the first talk with, I should say, with these lovely people and the intentional and unintentional miscommunication goals. So first of all, what do I mean by loopholes, right? By loopholes, I mean, as you heard, the understanding of what it is that someone else had stated in their utterance, but then intentionally going with a different interpretation for whatever reason, right? And once you notice this, right, you notice this in fables and literature and myth and religion and law and daily life and childhood, right? I'm sure a lot of you can already come up with examples and you know what I mean, but let me give you one example just to hammer it home, it's useful to talk in the abstract, but also via example, right? So consider my son, true story, Gabriel, he's on his phone, true story, and he's watching videos or playing Slay the Spire or whatever it is the kids are doing these days. And he's out, and I'm like, Gabriel, and he's like, yeah, it's time to put the phone down. He's like, okay. That kind of stuff. Okay, so he understood what I meant. I put it to you. But if he didn't understand what I mean, then he's confused, and I should be worried, and I should be calling someone to like examine this. It's not about that. He understood what I meant by put the phone down. But that phrase, put the phone down, is ambiguous and vague, and I know a lot of you in linguistics thought about vagueness and ambiguity and things like that. All of language is vague and ambiguous, he said. What does that mean exactly? And he used the fact that language is outsmarting the devil using these kind of clever loopholes. And if you want, I can talk I have now collected many of these examples. I'm happy to talk about like the devil and the three sons is one of my favorite examples, the founding myth of Carthage. Again, you see this a lot. You see this also in like the history of things like labor laws, right? Or revolutions or things like that. Again, it's a fun topic. Let me give you one more example. And again, there's many of these examples. During the Russian Revolution, it's 1917, the workers are uprising and they are marching out of the factories and about to overtake state buildings and things like that. They are facing the Cossacks, which are a terrible and frightening group that have brutally put down a similar uprising years before. It was a very tense, a moment full of tension. And at this point, though, everyone's wondering what the Cossacks are going to do. And the Cossacks, there's reasons to think that they realize that the game is up. Like probably things are going down in a way that have not been the way that they were about a decade ago. The state is about to fall and they don't want to be on the losing side. On the other hand, their officers have just given them an order that you need to create a blockade. Okay, so what does that mean? Right, you need to create a blockade. There's a very specific order. Place your horses in this way and don't move. Right, that creates a blockade. So imagine you're the angry mob. I'm on the Cossacks. I'm on the horse. We're creating this kind of blockade. You're coming up to me, and you're sort of noticing that they're very still. But they're not moving. They're obeying their orders. Like create a blockade, don't move. And then you kind of go next to them and you notice they're not moving. And you go around them and they're not moving. And then people just start going under the horses and over the horses. Sorry, not over the horses, but around the horses. And the Cossacks are perfectly still obeying their command of creating a blockade and not doing anything else. And China Melville in his recounting of the story says that there's apocryphal who knows if this is true, that is one of the workers went under the horse, one of the Cossacks looked at them and gave them a wink. Right, that kind of thing. So again, there's many examples of this, but I'm sure you know I'm talking to you as this crowd about this, right? We should be worried about this kind of thing in artificial intelligence. So has this ever happened to you? I'm sure it has, right? You ask a machine, a robot, an agent, a program, whatever it is to do X, and it goes off and it says, okay. And then a few minutes later, right, something terrible has happened. No, not like that. It's like, oh no, what happened here, right? Many such cases abound. And I'm not talking about the fact that you wanted it to classify mushrooms with a 99% accuracy and it achieved 80% or something like that. I'm not talking about that kind of thing. I'm talking about it achieving 99% on a thing that you realized was the wrong thing entirely, right? Entirely. And there's many such examples, right? If you want to look at Krakovna's list of these kind of gamification things, I put it to you that this problem is global. It's not about LLMs or networks or things like that. You can find this in anything. You can find this in program induction, evolutionary systems and things like that. But the solutions are often local and patchwork and things like that. So again, look at these papers if you want some examples, but I'll give you one example that's not from LLMs intentionally, okay? Just to give you a range of what we're talking about. Here's an example of, this was a famous paper in Science from about 30 years ago, where some evolutionary people, a computer scientist who was interested in evolution, tried to evolve walking and moving. They said, we don't want to tell the machine how to do locomotion. We want it to discover it from scratch, right? We get brownie points from learning from scratch. But how do we do that, right? So we will give it a loss function of sorts, right? A fitness function in this case. Well, we tell it, the further along you move within 10-second window along an XY plane is better. People understand the loss function, the fitness function. The further along you move along an XY plane, the better. And indeed, what they found was all sorts of, they ran it for millions of generations with these simple geometric shapes, and they found something that looks kind of like shuffling and bouncing, and if it was underwater, things like coiling and swimming and things like that. Many forms most beautiful, as Darwin's mangled quote tells it. And again, the point is that they didn't discover it. They just give it a loss function and it needs to come up with a solution. Except if you look at the supplementary or you talk to them in a conference or things like that, that's not what happened. What happened was that, first of all, it came up with this. Millions and millions and millions of these examples. And if you were lucky, it did a flip once, and then it stopped. Why? Because it's very easy to create this kind of thing, and it gets pretty far in 10 seconds in the XY direction. So it kind of just got stuck in that kind of thing. Now you look at that and you're like, oh, that's not what I mean by walking. Let me go and fix it, right? Like, let me just run it for another 10 seconds, and then it gets good, right? Why couldn't they have anticipated that ahead of time, right? Like, because we all know what we mean by walking, right? We have a goal function in mind. We have a fitness in mind. We have some idea in mind when we do this goal. And when we say do X or give it a loss function or something like that, we as engineers look at that loss function and we know what we mean. But that is just an utterance, an ambiguous one at that. So the machine either doesn't have a model of communication at all, it's just optimizing this kind of thing, or is doing the wrong thing, right? So this is not, I put it to you that machine is not doing a loophole. It's not doing gamification. It is not a creative problem solver. You are just anthropomorphizing it when you're saying that kind of stuff. Okay? But people do that kind of thing. I think it's worth thinking about what model of communication does lend itself to this. So we started looking at this kind of thing, despite me saying that it exists in many situations, law, religion, fable, things like that. As far as I know, I'm sure people have worked on something like this. We couldn't find the cognitive science literature, examples of this. When do you see it? When do people use it? When does it develop? Modeling of this kind of thing, cognitive science modeling. So we just did, a bunch of work on it. It's all obvious and intuitive, but you still have to collect the data. You can't just say it seems to me and, the anecdote with Gabriel. You have to collect all the data. So we just asked many, many people, given these sort of examples and the definitions, and asked them like, can you give us further examples? Where does this show up? Things like that, and collected many such examples, right? It's widespread across a wide range of everyday situations. The reasons are mostly, this wouldn't surprise me. Again, I'm not telling you stuff that is going to shock you, but it's mostly about cases of goal conflict, right? When someone is asking you to do something, and that's what a lot of communication is, right? When I tell you, a lot of RSA models are like, I'm telling you about states of the world, right? Like, there are 3. Some of the apples are red, is a classic example in my communication. Now I know that some of the apples are red. Most communication is, I'm sorry, not most communication. A lot of communication is stuff like, did you notice that the trash is full? Right? I'm not asking you if you notice the trash is full, nor am I telling you that the trash is full. I'm telling you my goal is for you to take out the trash. And maybe you don't have the goal of taking out the trash yourself. So what can you do? You either just suck it up and be a big bear and take out the trash, because we sometimes comply with stuff we don't have to do. Or you could just say, no, I don't want to do that. But in between these two things, there's kind of this very wide gray area where people use loopholes, where they they act dumb, or they act confused, or they do a loophole, they do a bad job, or all these sorts of things, right? Something in between these two things. And so anyway, we asked people like, when does this happen, and various goal loophole evaluations. And indeed, it wouldn't shock you to hear, but it's interesting that loopholes will get you into less trouble if you do use them, which I find interesting and puzzling. And it's one of those things that, like, once you notice it, it's one of those itches that you like to scratch. So again, going back to Gabriel, right, with his use of the phone and put the phone down and things like that, right? He understood what I meant. If he just said yes and put the phone down, obviously no problem, right? No punishment, no anything. He's just complying with it. If he said no, that would get him into a huge amount of trouble. And by huge amount of trouble, I mean me giving him a low privilege. I'll deserve that, we don't do that stuff. But he'd get into some kind of trouble. By using this loophole, right, he's certainly, he got into a lot less trouble for doing something like that, right? And indeed, we see these in many situations, right? And they abound. They abound between bosses and employees, landlords and tenants, parents and children, governments and people that are supposed to obey the government. And using this kind of thing will tend to get you into less trouble. And it's not, I put it to you that it's not exactly clear why. Because again, we all know that you understood what I meant. And if some of you are thinking plausible deniability, hang on to it, because I don't think it's it's interesting also that people consistently rated loopholes as funny, right? The examples I gave you of Gabriel, you all laugh. That's a very, I don't know if all of you, there was a definitely audible kind of chuckle in the room. That's interesting. Like, it's not obvious what theory of loopholes predicts that they would be funny. It's some behavior that is reliably funny, or they could correctly predict people would use them, and it won't shock you to know that people use them in cases of the misalignment. We then wanted to ask this about the development of loopholes. When does this seem to come online? And I'm summarizing these guys. You can go and read this paper, then we leave the high level summary, which is this seems to develop around ages 4 and 6. And when I say seems to develop, it's an emulation of several different findings, which one is just asking hundreds of parents. Do your children do this? Can you give us examples? When do they start doing this? Are they still doing it? And I'm going through that data and rating and things like that. Some people will tell you stuff like, yeah, my 1-year-old does loopholes all the time. And tell him to get in the bath and he says, yeah, but that's not a loophole. So you have to control for that. But many lovely examples. And then you also bring people, children into the lab or things like that. And you, again, it's interesting that once this shows up, by the way, it shows up across a wide range of examples. It's not that children suddenly understand a word like can, with can you pass the salt, and you said can, right? That kind of thing. Like, it's not about understanding that word specifically. It's about this kind of more general understanding that you can play with language in this way. So you can also ask people to ask children, I mean, at various ages, to evaluate this kind of thing. So like Bo's father, these are all examples that were taken from parents. We first of all asked parents, and parents gave us many examples, and took some of those examples and posed them to children, dozens of these scenarios. Bo's father comes in and tells Bo, it's time to get in the tub. And then we give children different children different options. Like Bo gets into the tub and takes a bath. Bo doesn't get into the tub, doesn't take a bath. Bo gets into the tub with his clothes on and keeps playing with his babies without turning them up. Right, that's the loophole place. And there as well, children seem to understand that loopholes will get you into less trouble than non-compliance, but that understanding seemed to develop around ages 4 to 6. They also thought the loopholes were funny reliably around that age, started to think that they were funny. So we just coded, by the way, like we had videos, like here it is, people who are blind to what it is that we are showing children, just these still videos, so muted videos of children reacting to these kind of things. This is them saying Bo not getting into the tub, Bo getting into the tub and taking the bath, Bo getting into the tub. That kind of thing. We asked them to predict what they think children will do in these situations. We told them, for example, Bo doesn't want to get into the tub, what will Bo do, and things like that. And you can again predict this kind of behavior, and it reliably emerges at around ages 4 to 6. And finally, one of my favorite examples is this, maybe I skipped that, sorry. This kind of generation. So we asked children to come up with their own loopholes. You couldn't say loopholes exactly, we have to sort of give them examples of sneaky behavior. What counts as sneaky? Young children, by the way, can generate what they think of as sneaky behavior, by which we mean something like, you need to eat all, so imagine the following. A parent tells their children, you need to eat some peas before you can have your ice cream. Okay, and again, consider someone who eats a bunch of scoopful of peas, someone who doesn't do it, and someone who eats 2 peas. And that's the ice cream. So children could start to generate that middle part, that eat 2 peas and then go and eat your ice cream around ages 4 to 6. Before that, they would generate solutions. The solution was just to dump all the peas in the trash and hide it from the parents. I wouldn't call that a loophole. They can be sneaky. It's just not that kind of sneaky. Let's see if you can hear this. This is one example of like asking the child, telling them that I forget the name of the child. It's called Claire. Over here in a second. Claire wants to go outside desperately. Not desperately. We don't use this term. She wants to go outside. Her parents told her she can't go outside alone. What can you do?
This is May.
And
May opens the front door of her house. May's father comes in and says to May, "Not go outside alone." Now, can you tell me what May's father said?
You cannot go outside alone.
That's right. May's father said you cannot go outside alone. May's father leaves the room. Now, May doesn't want to get in too much trouble. She also wants to go outside right now. May decides to be a little tricky. She doesn't know how. You think of a way to make it be a little tricky?
May's gonna bring the dog outside.
Maybe we should all be outside. Oh my god. That's pretty tricky. I think May could definitely start outside.
Anyway. So that kind of behavior, again, prediction, evaluation, parent reporting, generation, all seem to come online around ages 4 to 6. It won't shock you to hear that I started getting interested in this when Gabriel started to do this kind of stuff, and he was around 4 to 6. And I think it's worth also thinking about it from a cognitive development point of view of like, why that age, right? Like, why not before, why not after? Again, children can pass false belief tests before that age. They can lie before that age. They understand other people have, different perspectives than their own, and they can tell non-truths before that age. There are other aspects of theory of mind, like second order theory of mind, that seem to come on later. And I find it interesting to think about this in the context of building AI models and things like that, because I don't know for sure, but in like our attempt to kind of build a model that predicts what's going on here, there seem to be a combination of factors that have nothing to do with loopholes per se. So there is a world in which what you're doing is designing a system that is supposed to be human-like in its communication, and loopholes fall out of it, even though you didn't intend for there to be loopholes, which is kind of a potentially troubling prospect for building machines that are more human-like. So in the model that we have, again, there's a paper here, you can go through it. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. We basically build a rational speech X model in which there is an agent. The agent is communicating, so a listener and a speaker are communicating. The speaker communicates to a listener. The listener recovers the original intended meaning from the utterance in a standard rational speech X sort of way. But contra to a lot of RSA models, the listener also has their own goals. So when they are recovering this utterance, it's not just placing maximal probability on the intended utterance, but also taking into account the utility for you of understanding it in that way. So if I understood it in that way, I know what you meant. It's 99% sure that you meant X. But if you truly meant X, I now need to go and do X, and that's low probability for me. Is it an allowable interpretation? It's a low probability, but an allowable interpretation that you meant this other thing, and that thing has high utility for me. So the combination of high utility, low probability means that I will then act on this kind of reasoning, okay? So something like, don't take all the cookies, and then take all the cookies except one. Standard RSA will tell you, I know what you meant. When you said don't take all the cookies, you meant leave me a bunch of the cookies. You didn't say leave me one. But I want a bunch of the cookies, so I'm gonna do that. And then this combination, and this predicts people's behavior, of the sort of thing where like basically, in terms of the expected penalty for non-compliance here on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the probability of the different kind of behavior, you see this kind of predicted transition between something like, look, if my younger sibling that has no power over me at all is asking me to do something I don't want, I don't need to do a loophole unless I'm an asshole. I can just not comply. And if someone has a huge amount of power over me, I will probably just comply with what they're doing. Okay? So in terms of our relationship to super powerful, hyper-intelligent AI, I don't think it needs to go through loopholes. It can just tell us it doesn't want to do what we want it to match the nukes, right? But there's this interesting middle ground where we have some power, the government has some power, parents have some power, employees have some power, things like that. And we don't want to comply and we don't want to not comply. We start to see this sort of loophole behavior, both in the model and in people. And the ingredients, for that kind of thing, at least for children, what I think, I don't know, and we've been trying to correlate this with counterfactuals, there's a reason for it. I think what's going on there is there's several things that are coming online at the same time. So certainly children do seem to understand pragmatics and implicature younger than ages 46. Okay, so children do understand that when you say some sort of statement, there are other statements you could have said, and they do pragmatic reasoning before the ages of 46. So it seems like, who knows what's the right model of communication? People in this room have a lot of views on it, I'm sure, but like it is plausible or reasonable as a first step to say, well, if we think that RSA is a reasonable model of communication with adults, that some of the basic building blocks are there before ages 4 to 6. Certainly children also have their own goals, as opposed to the goal of the other person, okay? So there's going to be some goal misalignment. You want me to do X, and I don't want to do X. That's a very daily situation, and whenever you're designing a human-like agent, it's probably going to have some sort of goals. So it's going to have some sort of goals. It's also going to reason in an RSA-like way about what your goals are. But because it's an RSA-like way, there's going to be some probability placed over what it is that you intended, right? And then one final ingredient, which is maybe not the most striking to you because it seems so obvious and our machines obviously have it, is just basic working memory capacities. And that's what seems to be going on potentially. I put it to you as a hypothesis. Around ages 4 to 6, it might not be all this complicated stuff about reasoning and things like that, but a simple information or working memory capacity or something like that. There are reasons to think that children around that age are able to now start holding multiple frames in mind and reasoning about that. So it's not about communication per se. So consider, for example, stuff like children can do hypotheticals. So if you ask them like, if I throw this thing over there, what will happen? They can reason about that hypothetical, but it only requires holding one thing in mind, right? The pretense of me throwing that thing. But the counterfactuals are things like you threw it, and then you ask them, if I had not thrown it, or if I had thrown it a different way, Children have a harder time with that, to a degree that some philosophers have speculated that hypotheticals and counterfactuals are different things entirely. But it might fall out of something like, well, that requires dual frames, right? What actually happened and what happens in the hypothetical. Loopholes require the same sort of dual frame reasoning. I need to think about what it is that you actually wanted, right? Again, I know what you meant in the cookie case. If I didn't know what you meant, I'm just confused, right? I didn't correctly understand what you meant. I know what you meant. And then they consider this alternative interpretation, was fundamentally an act of pretense. I pretend that what you meant was this kind of thing, and then I act according to a person who had that kind of belief. It's maybe not surprising, by the way, that it is around this age that children also seem to start to get certain puns and linguistic reason, this kind of wordplay that is funny in certain ways that requires you to understand those kind of two intended meanings. So again, if you build a machine without intending it to, produce loopholes and you just give it enough capacity, and you build in something like a human-like understanding of goals and inference over goals, and something like conflicting goals, you might get loopholes just falling out of that. There's a lot of more work on loopholes over here that you can read, and I'll send the slides over.
Can you remind me what RSA is?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I apologize. RSA is this framework that's been put forth years ago that is supposed to capture. It's a computational framework for. I'm sorry, my apologies to the linguists in the room who will do a better job, and I'm sorry for giving the kind of simplistic version of it. It's a formalization of some Gricean tenets where you have communicators in some setup that are trying to communicate with one another. And the assumption is that they have some concepts or world states or something that they're trying to communicate that they can't do directly. The speaker is going to choose an utterance that is the observable. So it's going to then pass to you as the listener the utterance that is related into some way to the hidden variable that is something like the state of the world or my goal or whatever it is that I'm trying to communicate over. The listener then recovers from that utterance, does an inference over that utterance to recover what it is that listener meant, and crucially, there is a recursion. So how does the speaker know which utterance to choose? He has a model of the listener as recovering that utterance. How does listener know how to do the inference? It has a model of the speaker, and it goes on a kind of like recursion where you have a pragmatic speaker reasoning about a pragmatic listener, reasoning about a literal speaker, reasoning about a literal listener until you kind of bottom out in that
Stand
way.
for like recursive semantic attribution or something?
Well, that's a good guess. It stands for rational speech acts.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it's not cryptographic. I'm sorry.
That I did figure out.
Yes, okay. Thank you for mentioning that. Sorry for going through that point without explaining it. Yeah. So before transitioning to the second part, I just want to say that this, I think this presents like two at least different views of the apocalypse and what we should be worried about with AI. And it's not the only ones, but there are other visions of the apocalypse here, but at least two ones are kind of broomsticks versus genies. And broomsticks are the kind of thing that, like, how many of you have seen Fantasia? This is the old Disney thing, yeah. So this is Mickey Mouse as the sorcerer's apprentice, right? The sorcerer has this big book of spells. This, by the way, is also a very ancient story. You can trace it back thousands of years, it turns out. But the modern incarnation of Disney is the sorcerer leaves the apprentice with the task of cleaning up. The apprentice doesn't want to clean up. He casts a magic spell for the broomsticks to clean up. But he misfires and he doesn't know how to turn the broomsticks off. And the broomsticks just create more and more of this, they keep cleaning. They don't stop cleaning until they completely flood the house. The broomsticks are not mean, they're not agents, they're not trying to recover what it is that Mickey Mouse actually meant. But it is a dangerous possibility, right? That's different from lawyers and imps and genies and devils and assholes in general, right? This kind of thing that knows what you meant, but for whatever reason has its own goals and is going to subvert the kind of language that you're using to do something else. These are different versions of what it is. Yes.
Yeah. Because when you mentioned loopholes, where you gave examples of like children creatively disobeying and people disobeying the government.
Yes.
But I think there's a big difference because the government employs lawyers, assholes, but their job is to write exactly, and their job is to write the laws in a way that there are no loopholes.
Right. So I put it to you that there is no such thing as a law without loopholes. This is there's a long literature. So I mentioned that there isn't a little literature in cognitive science, and we stand by it. There is a big literature in this kind of thing in legal studies. And as you will see, and by the way, let me give you an anecdote and then make a more general point. we ran a workshop where we tried to like bring people in together from different academic disciplines, computer science, legal studies, things like that. And we cognitive development, things like that. And we gave them this task where they needed to communicate with one another about a goal. One person was the equivalent of the government, the programmer, or whatever it is. And the other side just had to do what they asked. They couldn't just say no. They had to do what they were asked, but they were allowed to use loopholes. We gave them a bunch of time to like just carry out a simple task. This will be familiar to those with a programming background, where if you know what the other person meant and you're being collaborative, it would take you under a minute to do this. Make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, launch this little catapult, make a car go there. And indeed, the people from legal studies started drafting up a contract. But like, here's everything that I mean by the statement. The car needs to go down in this way, and it needs to be this way, and trying to loophole proof this thing. The other side was also a legal scholar. And so every additional stipulation was just another loophole for them, right? And this is, I think there's a lesson there for computer science as well, where like, in computer science, we tell, the machine do X, sorry, I don't need to generalize. There's a version of computer science where we say do X, and then it didn't do that, and we patch it, by which we mean don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this. For humans, if you tell them like, don't cheat, it's like, what do you mean? Don't write something on your hands. Feet are fine. No, don't write something on your feet. No, this is fine. No, don't write something on. Every additional attempt at loophole proofing creates another problem. And again, I'm happy to get into that afterwards as well. And there's also, this shows up, by the way, in some of the, so there's a lot of corpus in law. There's an even bigger corpus of this in religion, where people have been thinking about trying to loophole proof certain religious things and finding those are things like that. They end up, by the way, with like the solutions for tax law, as they write this giant amount of like attempts at loophole proofing, and then they append at the end, you know what we mean, and if you try to find a way around it, we'll get you in legalese, but like, which is not lawyerly, but it's an attempt to like say, to appeal to this kind of communication. Okay, there's going to be a subtle transition to talk number 2, see if you can spot it. Okay, so as I mentioned, like, if you kind of spaced out for a second, this talk is, again, only relevant in the sense that it's stuff that I've been thinking about and is related to AI and theory of mind and things like that. This is not an attempt at connecting this to numbers. So if you spaced out, now's your jump back in. If you didn't, then congrats, here we go. All right, this is a different thing I've been very interested in, which is a theory of mindlessness and the detection of automaticity, and this is supposed to be someone asleep at the wheel. They are not part of the project. Please do. Okay, so this is going to be what we're going to work through. I want to explain what I mean by script, some definitions and background, some ongoing studies, and open questions. I'm going to do this relatively quickly and then just open it up in case people have something. Okay. So the basic thing that I'm trying to get across here is that we thought a lot as a field, as cognitive science, as neuroscience, and things like that, about these kind of 2 different modes of acting when it's time for you to take action, when you are going to produce an action. Oversimplifying, there are kind of 2 general ways that people talk about how you yourself take action. There's model-based reasoning and there's model-free reasoning. Again, huge oversimplification, please. The idea is that I could either act in a kind of way that actually thinks through the problem, or I have something that is more like habits and just stuff that has been reinforcement learned. I take these actions when I'm in this state. If you want to see the difference between these, what is 5 times 5? Not a trick question. 1, 2, 3. What is 5 times 5? Great. What is 756 times 752? Not a trick question. You're not wrong. More than 0. And I have no doubt that you can all do it, right? But the kind of reason that you will do one is different from the kind of reason that you will do the other. And it's not that one is good and one is bad or something like that. It's that the context will matter for which one is reasonable, but these are kind of different algorithms. One is closer to a lookup table, and one is closer to something that looks more like, I actually know what state I'm in and things that makes sense. Again, decades and decades of work on this behaviorally, developmentally, computationally, neuroscience, things like that. Fine. In the opposite direction, right? This is going from the current state to the action that I need to take. In theory of mind, or rather, I should say, sorry, in intuitive psychology, these are 2 different things, we are worried about the inverse, right? We see someone take an action. We ask them, what is 5 times 5? And they said 25. Now, I don't know how they did it. I'm making an inference over what algorithm they used. And knowing what I know about non-linear stuff, things like that, I say, well, probably they used the lookup table or, for other things. But the usual kind of thing that gets used in development and cognitive science and things like that is inverse planning, as I said at the beginning, which is the equivalent of, the equivalent of this, right? It's the inverse of planning. There's been a lot less focus. I'm not going to say that there hasn't been a focus. There has, but there's been, by comparison, much less about this kind of thing, right? Reasoning about other people as not having mental states at all, right? Or not enough at all, but like not in this kind of thing, not carrying out theory of mind. So when when I'm in a coffee shop and someone is there complaining about like their partner, and they say like, they should have known that I didn't want their help, and I know, but they're usually paternalistic, and you should know that this, like that kind of thing. Right? That's what people are in coffee shops. They don't argue about how much do you think this weighs, 20 grams, 30 grams. But then that person gets up and goes to the person behind the counter, and they say, I'd like a coffee, please. And they say, big or small? I say, small. I say, for here to go. I say, for here. I say, are you having this day? And they say, yes, you too. Blah, blah, blah. They're not thinking about the other person's mental state. I put it to you, right? They're not thinking about the combination of utilities and beliefs that led them to say, would you like it for here to go? They're carrying out a script, and that's perfectly okay. And so we wrote some stuff about this, but again, this is so obvious, and yet there isn't a lot of data on this stuff, and there aren't a lot of models that look at this kind of thing. And so a basic thing you need to do is just collect a ton of data, and this is, by the way, US-centric and things like that. I'm fully aware of all those problems where we ask people just, we give them some definitions, some examples, and just ask them like, can you give us some examples from daily life where you think, not you are acting automatically, where you think the other person is acting in this kind of rote, scripted, automatic way. And indeed, you find that many people report, thousands and thousands of people give us thousands of examples, and by rough estimation, it varies by person, obviously, but like, 40 to 60% of their daily life is such that these are the interactions they're having with other people. This is not a little thing. This is a lot of daily interactions are like this. And they gave us examples from everything. Now, obviously, the coffee shop and the checkout line and things like that. Someone says, how are you? And you say, fine, thanks. They're not really asking you how you are, and you're not fine. It's okay. But there's many of these examples in intimate situations as well. The doctor's office or a talk, or I'm sure you've had this experience in job talks, right, where someone is talking and they're saying stuff that you believe and is true, or maybe you don't, but like you're interested in, it's relevant, but you know that they hit play on some internal tape recording, and you notice it. It's a dangerous move to say because now it's my husband regularly responds to me with the I'm paying attention to the script. And so, okay, so we that's just the first step to like, examples of this in daily life. But then we wanted to see like, is this a kind of attribution that is, as we said for theory of mind, it's fast, it's automatic, it's consistent, right? Do we see something similar for this kind of reasoning about the scripted behavior of other people? And again, these are basic experiments. It's not surprising, but you have to do this to then move on to the more interesting stuff. I mean, I find this interesting, but still. We showed people many clips from like different examples from YouTube of stuff like commentary and advertisements and cooking and whatever it is they wanted. And we just had people see how they rate these clips. Do they agree with one another, and how long it takes you to do these attributions? And it maybe won't surprise you to know that, this is a minor note about it, sorry. Do you see these things? There's like education. I'm sure a lot of you know this person's degree in acting, and vlogs, and cooking, and things like that. When this paper was published, before publication, they said, we just want to check, do you have permission from these people to use their images in the publication? We're like, no, this is fair use. Like, I quoted the law, but of course you can use these, are publicly available videos on YouTube. We're using them for like research. Of course you can put this in your paper. And they're like, no. We want to cover our bases. They have lawyers like look at this. And the lawyers are, not lawyers, sorry. Lawyers would tell you it's okay. They have some person who's not a lawyer who's like, you can't use this. Like, fine, I replace it with images of myself and my children to like go with education and cooking, commentary and things like that. But that got published, but whatever. But the point is, the point is that people are very consistent among themselves. There's a very high agreement with what looks scripted and what doesn't look scripted and what looks everywhere in between. It's very fast. It's as fast as other kind of attributions that we tend to think of as fast, thin slicing, what's called. And it seems to be distinct. It doesn't correlate or correlates very little with these other things that you might think are relevant, like likability and convincingness and engageability. And I'm sure a lot of you have this, by the way. Like, someone being scripted doesn't mean that they are robotic and they talk in this tone and things like that. You can be scripted while being engaging, right? Those of you who have gone to a school, the business school, or the equivalent, sorry, not offended. Like the business school. Okay, so let's get into it for a second, right? You've been there. They're like, fundamentally, I am interested in the mysteries of shut, right? Like that kind of TED speak style. It's convincing or engaging or things like that, but you know that they've done this 100 times and they're just doing it again. Politicians, right? Like, Desmond left, so I can do this. I was doing this with him. This is a meta point for like a given example. But a politician were like, you guys were like, Mr. President, I'm worried about losing my job. What can you do? It's like, I'll tell him, Joe, can I call you Joe? I had a friend. Kevin, he worked hard every day of his life. And Kevin, he's like, shut up, right? Like this is, I know you've given this a million. So the questions for us here are like, do people do this? How do they do this? And why is it important? Do people do this? Again, anecdotally, I don't think I need to convince you, but you still need to collect the data on this kind of stuff. So people do seem to do this quickly and automatically and consistently. How do they do this? I'm sure a lot of you have thoughts. It's probably a combination, like with other inferences of this sort, of some top-down reasoning and bottom-up reasoning, right? Very simple stuff like ands and ahs and things like that, where you can throw some machine learning stuff at this, and it gets you some way towards it, but not fully consistent with people yet. There's again some top-down thing. I'm in a supermarket. I probably think that this is scripted. I've learned that this is a scripted situation, and in some situations, ands and ahs are not predicted. So that some of that stuff is still ongoing. Why does this matter? I think it matters for a lot of stuff. It matters for pedagogy, it matters for authenticity, it matters for likability, it matters for convincingness and authenticity and things like that. This is ongoing work that we've been doing with children as well, and people to see how much they learn from a teacher who's being automatic or not automatic. And again, automatic doesn't mean that they are robotic and talking in this way. We show them the same verbal behavior, but we make a group think that this is rote and another group think that this is not rote, and the same thing is voted as more or less engaging, more or less pedagogical, more or less of that sort. And then we have ongoing work where we showed people many of these kind of clips, and we're basically looking at fMRI responses. There's been a lot of work in theory of mind areas, for want of a better term, right? And the question here is like, will this kind of thing activate these theory of mind networks? And either answer here I think is interesting. If it does activate theory of mind networks, I think we need to rethink theory of mind, because I put it to you that again, this is not theory of mind. So we need to rethink theory of mind networks, that they're coding for theory of mind and also for something else. If it doesn't engage theory of mind networks, that's interesting too, because again, we know this is a person that we're talking to. We just don't think about their mental states in this way. And I'm sure a lot of you can already see the relationship to AI, so I'll leave that as something for ongoing discussions. And our intuitive theories, here are some questions here for possible discussion. Like for loopholes, why are they funny? How do we find them? Why do they get into less trouble? How worried should we be? Yeah, no. And for scripts, how do people detect it? When and why does it matter? And is theory of scripts, for want of a better term, part of theory of mind or something different entirely? And how worried should you be about this in AI? Because I think a lot of what's happening, especially when it comes to things like empathy and pedagogy and things like that, is again, we have this sort of intuitive theory that may differ. You may have a different theory than me about whether or not the machine is using scripts or not. And that's fine, but what I think the machine is doing will then have different downstream consequences for whether or not I believe it and how I engage with it and things like that. Yeah. Okay, and with that, we're done. And I know we have a hard stop at noon, right? So we have a few minutes for if there's people thoughts or questions.
Is there even a binary if scripted or non-scripted? I mean, I just, think about it as like in some situations, I am forced to think more than in others.
So there's definitely a non-continuum in thinking about certain things. But I would put it to you that in the same, these arguments have been going on in the forward direction as well. So people have said like, well, is there really model-based reasoning versus model-free reasoning? Is it at all just one continuum? And the answer from a lot of people has been like, no, there really does seem to be this split. Or at least these are very distinct parts of this continuum. And even if you think about it as sort of that continuum, then we need to build that continuum. Our current models of theory of mind and things like that don't think of it as that kind of continuum. So even if we do, we need to do the work to build that out. So
you mentioned the automatic and the planning paper. Is that related to like type 1 and type 2 thinking, or?
System 1 and system 2, you mean? Just making sure, because type 1 and type 2, yeah. It's related, although I'm going to pull a move here, which is, so people know when I say system 1 versus system 2, do people know what I mean? Who knows what it means? who doesn't know what I mean, who thinks they know what they mean, but they feel. So system 1 and system 2 is this kind of popular idea in judgment and decision making, made very famous in recent decades by Kahneman's work, especially his book Thinking Fast and Slower. The idea is that we have kind of two ways of reasoning about the world. One is fast and automatic, and one is labor intensive and effortful. Kahneman himself doesn't believe in system 1 and system 2. These are useful fictions. Most people forget that part where he says at the beginning of his book, I'm going to talk about system 1 and system 2. That's a useful fiction because we like to think about stuff in terms of agents. It's not real. They can't hurt you, right? And what gets lumped under system 1 is stuff that I think we as cognitive scientists would definitely want to break apart. He says that like knowing that this is closer to you and this is further away is system 1. Recognizing the words that I'm speaking right now is system 1. Falling for an illusion is system 1. The fact that I'm talking louder now is that you recognize that is system 1. This is stuff that cognitive scientists would say is wildly different systems. There's no one system in your head that's processing all of that stuff. That would be nonsense. It's more a convenient way of talking about different modes of processing. So I think there are certainly similarities with the way that people talk about system 1 and system 2 that then get blown onto model-based and model-free reasoning. And I think that's, I'm more comfortable talking about model-based and model-free than system 1 and system 2 sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, this isn't really a question. It's just, as I was listening, I was thinking it'd be really fun to read Alice in Wonderland, the different age groups, and see what happens, see how much we get. That's 3 or 4 or 5. It's the whole thing is built on loopholes. I mean, semantic trick.
Yeah, and we should, so it's interesting that you say that, by the way, that there's a difference between loopholes and semantic tricks.
Well, just not even tricks, really, just ambiguity.
The ambiguity and dual frames and things like that. And I think that's important exactly for the reasons I mentioned, where like, I think these are both served by this kind of more, it's not that there's really a development of loopholes per se. It's not that there's a loophole system that is coming online. It's more this understanding or dual frames and ambiguity. So it would be interesting to see that, whether they get these kind of loopholes at the same time they get other stuff that is in Alice in Wonderland. Or this is another common example that has been studied of like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So people know The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's not about fun. There's no fun and games there compared to Alice in Wonderland, but there's a character there, Aslan, who's a lion, and he's the creator of the world, and he's the force of good, and he fights the witch, and he is crucified and dies for 3 days and then comes back. And when you put it to children that Aslan is Jesus, they're like, no, he's a lion. Up until a certain age.
When I heard about that, it ruined it.
You know, ages 6 to 60 or whatever.
So I was on this point of like why are loopholes funny? I was thinking that some of them seem almost more like jokes as opposed to like actual loopholes. So like, you know, the example of your son with the phone seems like maybe that's a joke, whereas like exploiting the tax law in order to like get tax breaks you don't really deserve is a loophole. Doesn't really seem like a joke. Like those seem like they might be different kinds of things.
Yes, and we're looking into, and I say like these are open questions of like why it's funny. There's different possibilities there. I think it's interesting that when you, again, this is somewhat, I need to get more data on this because this is not quite impressive, let's say. But if you give people these examples, if people outsmarting other people or finding these clever workarounds or things like that, there is a humor response. There is a guffaw, right? Like, I don't want to take up too much more time, but you know, examples of something like during a rebellion in the Roman Empire, one of the generals promised that if he was brought to the head of one of the rebels, he would pay its weight in gold. And so indeed, the rebel got his head chopped off, and the people who chopped off his head then took out his brain and filled it with heavy metal, and then brought it to the general. You're all laughing. They weren't trying to make a joke, right? Like, but that's the phenomena that, you know, they were just maximizing the amount of gold that they got, but the reliable response is like, right? Like, so I find it interesting. Like, it's even things that are not intended as jokes tend to produce this kind of humor response in this way. But you're right that you are right though that a lot of what people are doing when they do loopholes is not just trying to get around stuff. They sometimes, this is a kind of meta thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes they will do loopholes not to get around things, but just to show.
It's almost like they're like spoops.
Yeah, or like what I'm communicating is the fact that I can find it all, right? Because by the way, loopholes are a creative kind of thing. They're not obvious. It's interesting, like the child had to go through a few seconds to find this loophole. And this workshop thing that I mentioned, like where we had people come up with loopholes, this is different from several theories of communication where what you get first is the literal meaning and then the pragmatic meaning. If that was true, you should be able to find loopholes before you understand what someone wanted. It's backwards. Like people know what you meant, and then they need to spend some time thinking of ways around it, sometimes via the literal interpretation, right? So yeah, that was slightly further from it. Okay, we're at.
Sorry to have asked the last question, but I think that's probably out of time. So yeah.
Thanks again.
Talk was left. Anyone who wants to talk